They say that when Count Georgy Thurzo and his men broke through the heavy oak doors of Chachtas Castle on the night of December 30th, 1610, they found a girl still breathing in the main hall, her body pierced in so many places that she looked more like a pincushion than a human being. Another lay dead nearby, drained of blood, her skin pale as winter snow. In the dungeons below, they discovered others, some alive but barely, their flesh burned and cut and torn, their hands broken, their mouths sewn shut with crude stitches. The smell of death hung thick in the stone corridors, and when they searched the castle grounds, they found bodies buried in the gardens, hidden beneath floorboards, walled up in secret chambers. Some estimates would later claim 650 victims, though the exact number would never be known with certainty. What they did know, what the testimonies would reveal in horrifying detail, was that for years, perhaps decades, the mistress of this castle had been torturing and murdering young women with a cruelty that defied comprehension. Her name was Elizabeth Báthory, and history would remember her as the Blood Countess, one of the most prolific female serial killers the world has ever known. But the question that would haunt scholars for centuries was this: was she truly a monster, or was she a powerful woman destroyed by those who coveted her wealth and lands? Let me take you back to where it all began, to a time when nobility meant power beyond imagination, and that power could corrupt in ways that still shock us more than 400 years later. Elizabeth Báthory was born on August 7th, 1560, in Báthory, Hungary, into one of the most powerful noble families in all of Europe. The Báthory family controlled vast territories in Transylvania and Hungary, owned dozens of castles and estates, commanded armies, and counted kings and princes among their relatives. Her uncle, Stephen Báthory, would become King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, one of the most powerful monarchs in Central Europe. Her father was Baron George Báthory, brother of the voivode of Transylvania. Her mother was Baroness Anna Báthory, herself the daughter of another voivode. The family tree was tangled with itself through generations of intermarriage designed to keep wealth and power concentrated within the bloodline, and this inbreeding had consequences that manifested in various disturbing ways among different family members. Young Elizabeth spent her childhood at Aix Castle, a massive fortress that rose from the Hungarian plains like something from a dark fairy tale. She was raised Protestant in a time when religion defined much of European politics and warfare, educated in Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek, taught to read and write when many noblewomen remained illiterate. By all accounts, she was intelligent, beautiful, and cultured, everything a noblewoman of her time was expected to be. But there were signs even then that something was wrong. She suffered from seizures, violent episodes that contemporaries diagnosed as falling sickness, what we would now recognize as epilepsy. The treatments for this condition were barbaric even by the standards of the 16th century. One common remedy involved rubbing the blood of a non-sufferer on the lips of the epileptic, or giving them a mixture of blood and crushed skull to consume as the seizure ended. From childhood, then, Elizabeth was introduced to blood as medicine, as cure, as something with power beyond its mere physical properties. She was also exposed to violence from an early age. The castle where she grew up was run with an iron fist, and servants who displeased their masters were routinely beaten, sometimes tortured, occasionally killed. This was not considered unusual or particularly shocking in an era when peasants were viewed as little better than property, when the nobility held absolute power over the lives of those beneath them. But even within this context of casual cruelty, the Báthory family stood out. Some of Elizabeth's relatives were known sadists, practitioners of black magic, adherents of religious heresies that appalled even the tolerant Protestants of the time. One uncle was said to have instructed her in Satanism, though how much of this is historical fact versus later embellishment remains unclear. What is certain is that violence was woven into the fabric of her upbringing, normalized to the point where it became almost invisible. At age 11, Elizabeth was betrothed to Ferenc Nadezhdy, a 19-year-old count from another powerful Hungarian family. The marriage was arranged to consolidate power and territory between two noble houses, a common practice that treated children as chess pieces in games of dynastic advancement. They were married in 1575 when Elizabeth was 15 years old, and because the Báthory name carried more prestige than Nadezhdy, Ferenc took his wife's surname, becoming Count Ferenc Báthory Nadezhdy. The wedding was attended by 4,000 guests, a lavish display of wealth and power that announced to all of Hungary that these two families were now united. As a wedding gift, Ferenc gave Elizabeth Chachtis Castle, the fortress in the Carpathian Mountains that would later become synonymous with horror. The couple settled first at Nadezhdy Castle in Sarvar, a massive fortress in western Hungary that served as the administrative center for their combined estates. Ferenc was a military man, a soldier who spent most of his time away from home leading Hungarian forces in battles against the Ottoman Empire, which had been pushing into Central Europe for decades. He was known for his brutality in warfare, earning the nickname, the Black Knight of Hungary, for his ruthless tactics against the Turks. When he was home, he apparently taught his young wife techniques of torture that he had learned or invented during his military campaigns. Witnesses would later testify that Ferenc had a special torture chamber built for Elizabeth's amusement, that he gave her gloves with iron claws attached so she could rake the flesh from servants who displeased her, that he encouraged her sadistic impulses rather than restraining them. But Ferenc was often absent, away at war for months or years at a time, and during these periods, Elizabeth was left in charge of administering the family's vast holdings. This was not unusual. Noblewomen often managed estates while their husbands fought in wars. What was unusual was the scope of Elizabeth's power and the isolation in which she wielded it. She oversaw 17 villages, multiple castles, hundreds of servants and peasants whose lives were entirely in her hands. There was no one to check her authority, no one to question her decisions, no one to intervene when she began to indulge in cruelties that went beyond the casual violence of her era. Some historians suggest that her first murders may have begun as early as the 1580s, though the evidence for this is thin. What seems more likely is that she engaged in brutal punishments of servants that occasionally resulted in death, acts that were technically illegal, but in practice rarely prosecuted when the victims were peasants and the perpetrator was a powerful noblewoman. Between 1585 and 1595, Elizabeth bore 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. She apparently was a reasonably attentive mother by the standards of nobility, though the children were largely raised by servants and tutors as was customary. The pregnancies and childbirths temporarily interrupted whatever darker activities she might have been engaging in, but they did not fundamentally change who she was or what she was capable of. Ferenc died in 1604 at age 48 after developing a debilitating illness that left him in constant pain, eventually becoming permanently disabled. His death removed the last restraint on Elizabeth's behavior, the last person who might have had the authority or inclination to stop her. She was 44 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and utterly free to do as she pleased. It was after Ferenc's death that the true horror began, or at least that it escalated to levels that could no longer be ignored or excused. Elizabeth moved primarily to Chachtis Castle, the fortress Ferenc had given her as a wedding gift nearly 30 years earlier. It sat atop a rocky hill in what is now Slovakia, surrounded by forests and farmland, its stone walls thick enough to muffle any screams that might escape from within. The castle had multiple levels, dungeons carved into the rock beneath, towers rising above, secret passages and hidden chambers known only to those who lived there. It was a perfect place for someone who wanted to commit horrors away from prying eyes, and that is exactly what Elizabeth did. She gathered around herself a core group of loyal servants who would become her accomplices in murder. The most important was Ilona Jo, sometimes called Helena Jo, who had been Elizabeth's nursemaid when she was a child and remained devoted to her mistress into adulthood. There was Dorothea Schenz, known as Dorka, described in court documents as a witch or sorceress, though what this meant in practice was that she knew folk remedies and dark magic that peasants whispered about. There was János Udvari, sometimes called Fico, a young man who helped with the physical labor of disposing of bodies. And there was Katerina Binica, who would later claim she had been forced to participate through threats and violence, that she had been as much a victim as a perpetrator. Together, these 5 people created a system for luring young women to the castle, torturing them, and disposing of their bodies. The victims were initially servant girls from nearby villages, daughters of peasants who were offered positions in the castle as maids, seamstresses, or kitchen workers. For poor families, having a daughter work in a noble household was an opportunity, a chance for steady wages and perhaps connections that might improve the family's status. Some families were actually paid small amounts of money or given gifts to send their daughters to Chachtas. Others were deceived, told their daughters would learn valuable skills or receive education, and some girls simply disappeared from roadsides or fields, taken by force and dragged to the castle by Elizabeth's servants. Once inside the castle walls, they discovered that they had not been hired to work but to die. The testimonies that would later emerge in court proceedings described tortures that seemed designed not just to cause pain, but to explore the limits of human suffering, to discover exactly how much agony a body could endure before death finally came. Elizabeth and her accomplices would strip the girls naked and tie them spread-eagle to wooden frames, or bind their hands above their heads so tightly with Viennese cord that the circulation was cut off and their hands turned black. Then the tortures would begin. Needles and pins were driven under fingernails, into lips, into breasts and genitals. Some girls had their fingers broken one by one, methodically, while Elizabeth watched. Others were beaten with clubs or whips until their skin broke open and blood ran down their bodies in streams. Still others were cut with scissors, their flesh snipped away in small pieces, removing fingers, noses, lips, chunks of breast and thigh. Burning was a favorite method. Witnesses testified that Elizabeth would heat irons, coins, keys, or candles until they were red-hot and then press them against bare flesh, holding them there while the skin blistered and charred, and the smell of burning meat filled the torture chamber. She would pour boiling water over victims, scalding them until their skin peeled away. In winter, she devised a particularly cruel torture involving ice and freezing water. Girls would be stripped naked and doused with water, then forced outside into the snow where the water would freeze on their skin. Elizabeth would have servants continue pouring water over the victims while they stood in the cold, creating layers of ice that encased their bodies. The girls would beg and scream, and eventually fall silent as hypothermia set in, their bodies turning blue and then gray, death coming slowly from exposure. Some victims were starved, locked in cells and given no food for days or weeks until they wasted away to skeletons. Others were covered in honey and left outside for bees, wasps, and ants to feast upon, their bodies swelling from thousands of stings and bites. Elizabeth reportedly would bite chunks of flesh from her victims' breasts, shoulders, faces, and arms, tearing away meat with her teeth like an animal. One particularly horrifying testimony described how she forced a girl to cook and eat her own flesh, cutting pieces from the victim's body, and making her consume them before finishing the torture with death. Another witness spoke of girls having their mouths sewn shut with thick thread so they could not scream, their lips stitched together while Elizabeth continued to torture them in silence. The sexual nature of many of these tortures suggests that Elizabeth derived some kind of gratification from the violence, though whether it was truly sexual in nature or simply sadistic pleasure in causing suffering remains a matter of debate among historians and psychologists who have studied the case. What is clear is that the torture sessions could last hours or even days, that Elizabeth would sometimes grow tired and take breaks, returning later to resume the torment, that she seemed to have an inexhaustible appetite for cruelty. Witnesses described her directing the servants in their work, telling them exactly where to cut or burn or beat, sometimes participating directly, other times simply watching with apparent fascination as the life slowly drained from her victims. When the girls finally died, their bodies had to be disposed of quickly and secretly. Initially, the victims were buried in the castle church graveyard at night, with a priest named Istvan Magyari either bribed or threatened into conducting hasty midnight burials. But this created problems as the number of bodies mounted. People began to notice that the graveyard was filling up faster than could be explained by natural deaths among the castle's residents and staff. So Elizabeth's accomplices began burying bodies in other locations, in gardens on the castle grounds, in holes dug beneath the castle walls, in the fields and forests surrounding Chachtas. Some bodies were hidden inside the castle itself, stuffed into spaces beneath floorboards, bricked up inside walls, left to rot in dungeons where no one ever went. A few were even thrown into rivers or streams, weighted down with stones so they would sink and disappear. The numbers varied wildly in later testimonies, but what seems clear is that dozens of girls were dying, perhaps hundreds over the years that Elizabeth operated with impunity. The exact count would never be determined, but witnesses at her trial would speak of 36 victims, 51 victims, some claiming knowledge of hundreds more. One servant girl named Susanna would testify that she had seen a book or ledger in which Elizabeth kept a list of her victims, and that this list numbered 650 names. The book itself was never produced at trial, if it ever existed at all, but the number 650 became attached to Elizabeth's legend, making her, by some counts, the most prolific female serial killer in history. By the late 1600s, rumors of what was happening at Chachtas Castle had spread throughout the region. Families were hiding their daughters, refusing to let them take positions at the castle no matter how much money was offered. The local villages were whispering about the Blood Countess, about girls who went into the castle and never came out, about screams heard in the night, about the smell of death that seemed to hang over the place like a fog. Priest Istvan Magyari, who had been burying bodies at Elizabeth's direction, finally could no longer remain silent. He wrote letters to authorities describing what he had witnessed, pleading for someone to investigate. But Elizabeth was protected by her family name, by her wealth, by her connections to the most powerful people in Hungary. No one wanted to move against her, not when doing so might bring down the wrath of the entire Báthory clan. But then Elizabeth made a critical mistake. She began targeting daughters of the lesser nobility, girls from families that, while not as powerful as the Báthory, still had enough status that their disappearance could not be easily ignored. In 1607, Elizabeth established something she called a gynaeceum, essentially a finishing school where daughters of minor nobles could learn courtly etiquette, proper behavior, the skills needed to advance in society. It was a brilliant cover, giving her access to a higher class of victim, while providing a legitimate explanation for why multiple young women were living at the castle. Parents eager for their daughters to learn from and be associated with the powerful Countess Báthory sent their girls to Chachtas, not knowing they were sending them to their deaths. These girls died just like the peasant girls before them, subjected to the same tortures, disposed of in the same ways. But their families had resources and connections that peasant families lacked. When their daughters failed to return home, when letters stopped coming, when inquiries were met with vague explanations or outright lies, these families went to King Matthias II demanding answers. They filed formal complaints with the courts. They spoke to other nobles. They created pressure that even someone as powerful as Elizabeth could not entirely withstand. And there was another factor at play. King Matthias owed Elizabeth an enormous debt, money he had borrowed to fund his wars and had no intention of repaying. If Elizabeth were convicted of crimes serious enough to result in the seizure of her estates and wealth, that debt would be cancelled, those obligations erased. Whether this financial motivation was the primary driver of what happened next, or merely a contributing factor, remains a subject of historical debate. In 1610, King Matthias ordered his cousin, Count György III, the Palatine of Hungary who oversaw judicial matters, to investigate the allegations against Elizabeth Báthory. Thurzo sent notaries Moses C. Zurecki and Andras of Kerester to gather evidence and testimonies. They interviewed hundreds of people, servants who had worked at the castle, villagers who had seen or heard things, parents whose daughters had disappeared, survivors who had managed to escape before being killed. The testimonies they collected painted a picture of horror that shocked even hardened officials accustomed to the casual cruelties of their era. This was not ordinary abuse of servants, not the kind of violence that nobility routinely inflicted on those beneath them. This was systematic, prolonged, sadistic torture and murder on a scale that defied comprehension. One witness after another described the same patterns of behavior, the same methods of torture, the same disposal of bodies. Court officials named Benedek Disiot and Imre Medjuri testified that they had personally witnessed Elizabeth torture and kill young servant girls, that they had seen bodies carried out of the castle, that they knew of specific victims by name. A castellan at one of Elizabeth's castles testified that he knew of at least 175 girls who had died, possibly 200 or even 300, though he emphasized he did not know how they had died since he was not permitted into Elizabeth's private quarters unless summoned. Noblewomen who had sent their daughters to the Gynaeceum testified that their daughters had been tortured and killed, that they had seen other girls at the castle with broken fingers and scorched hands, with burns from red-hot irons and wounds from beatings. On the night of December 30th, 1610, Thurzo arrived at Chachtas Castle with a group of armed men to make arrests. According to the accounts that emerged later, they found Elizabeth in the midst of a torture session, with victims in various states of distress throughout the castle. One girl was dying from her wounds in the main hall. Bodies were discovered in dungeons and hidden chambers. The evidence was overwhelming and could not be denied even by someone of Elizabeth's status and power. She was placed under house arrest in her own castle, while her servants were taken into custody for interrogation. The servants, unlike Elizabeth, were tortured to extract their confessions, a standard practice in the judicial system of the time. Under this duress, they admitted to participating in the murders, though they claimed they had been acting on Elizabeth's orders, that they had been forced to help through threats and violence, that she was the true architect of the horrors. Their confessions varied in details but agreed on the fundamental facts. Many girls had been tortured and killed, their bodies hidden in various locations around the castle and grounds, and Elizabeth Báthory had been the driving force behind it all. The trial of Elizabeth's accomplices took place in January of 1611 in the town of Báthory. The proceedings were conducted publicly, with testimony heard from over 289 witnesses, though most of these provided only hearsay or second-hand information rather than direct evidence. The court convicted the 4 main accomplices on 80 counts of murder, though they acknowledged that the true number of victims was likely much higher. The sentences were brutal even by the standards of the time. Alona Jo and Dorothea Schenz, the 2 older women who had been Elizabeth's primary helpers in torture, were condemned to have all their fingers torn out with red-hot pincers before being burned alive at the stake. This execution was carried out in Báthory in front of a crowd of witnesses. János Ujvari, because of his youth and the belief that he had been less culpable than the women, was sentenced to beheading, a far less painful death, after which his body was burned on the same pyre as the women. Katerina Binica received a life sentence rather than execution, based on testimony that she had been coerced and abused by the others. Another servant named Erzsébet Magyarova, who initially escaped capture, was hunted down and burned alive when she was finally apprehended. Elizabeth herself was never formally tried or convicted. As a member of one of the most powerful noble families in Hungary, putting her on public trial would have been politically impossible, potentially destabilizing the entire social order. Instead, a deal was arranged. Elizabeth would be placed under house arrest for the remainder of her life, confined to her chambers in Chachtas Castle. In exchange, The Báthory family would cancel the massive debt owed by King Matthias, and Elizabeth's children would retain their inheritance rights. Her holdings would not be seized by the crown, but would pass to her descendants according to normal inheritance laws. Elizabeth was bricked into a set of rooms in Chachtas Castle, with only small slits left open for food and air to be passed through. She would spend the remaining 4 years of her life in this prison of her own making, able to move about her rooms but never to leave them, never to see the outside world again. The exact conditions of her confinement remain unclear. Some accounts say she was literally walled up, that masons sealed the doorways with bricks leaving only those small openings. Other accounts suggest she was simply locked in her chambers under constant guard, unable to leave but not actually entombed. What is certain is that she remained in those rooms from December 1610 until August 21st, 1614, when a guard looking through one of the openings found her lying face down on the floor, dead at age 54. The cause of death was not recorded but was presumably natural given her age and the stress of her confinement. She was initially buried in the church at Chachtas, but an uproar among the local villagers, who did not want her body defiling their sacred ground, led to her being moved to the family estate at Ext. Eventually her body disappeared entirely, moved again to some unknown location, possibly to the family crypt at Ext, though the exact location of her grave is lost to history. For generations after her death, the story of Elizabeth Báthory was told and retold, growing more elaborate and sensational with each telling. The legend that emerged was of a countess who bathed in the blood of virgin girls, believing it would keep her young and beautiful. This particular detail, the blood baths that would become the most famous aspect of her story, appears to have been added long after her death. The first mention of Elizabeth bathing in blood doesn't appear in any historical document until 1729, more than a century after she died, in a book by Jesuit scholar Laszlo Tiraxi called Tragica Historia. Tiraxi claimed that Elizabeth would have her servants cut the throats or wrists of young girls and drain their blood into a tub where she would bathe, believing the virgin blood would preserve her youth and beauty. This image was so powerful, so viscerally horrifying, that it overshadowed all the other documented tortures, becoming the defining element of the Blood Countess legend. But there is no contemporary evidence that Elizabeth ever bathed in blood. None of the witnesses at the 1611 trial mentioned it. None of the confessions extracted from her servants described it. It seems to have been a later invention, perhaps inspired by folkloric beliefs about blood having magical properties, perhaps simply a sensational detail added to make an already horrifying story even more shocking. What the actual testimonies described was torture for torture's sake, cruelty that seemed to have no purpose beyond causing suffering. Elizabeth apparently did bite chunks of flesh from her victims and consume them, which several witnesses testified to. She did cover victims in blood during torture sessions, though this was a byproduct of the violence rather than a deliberate bath. But the image of her luxuriating in tubs of virgin blood appears to be myth rather than history. In the centuries since her death, Elizabeth Báthory has become a figure of legend and pop culture, inspiring countless books, films, plays, operas, and other artistic works. She has been portrayed as a vampire, a witch, a demon in human form. Some have suggested she inspired Bram Stoker's creation of Count Dracula, though Stoker's notes for the novel make no mention of her and the connections seem tenuous at best. She has been compared to Vlad the Impaler, another Eastern European noble known for extreme cruelty, though they lived in different centuries and there is no evidence they were ever connected. In modern times, she has even been claimed by some as a feminist icon, a powerful woman destroyed by a patriarchal system that could not tolerate female independence, though this interpretation requires ignoring or downplaying the substantial evidence of actual crimes. The question of Elizabeth's guilt has become increasingly complicated as modern historians have examined the case. There are legitimate questions about the reliability of the evidence against her. Of the 289 witness testimonies, more than 250 were either hearsay or provided no substantive information. Much of the direct evidence came from servants who were tortured, which automatically makes their confessions suspect by modern standards. The famous book listing 650 victims was never produced and may never have existed. Count Thurzo, who led the investigation, was Elizabeth's cousin and may have had his own motivations for seeing her imprisoned, particularly if it helped resolve King Matthias's debt problems. Some historians have argued that Elizabeth was the victim of a conspiracy, that she was a wealthy, powerful widow whose lands and money were coveted by male relatives and the crown, that the accusations were exaggerated or fabricated to justify seizing her assets. But there are also problems with the conspiracy theory. Even if we discount the most extreme claims, even if we reduce the victim count from hundreds to dozens, even if we explain away some of the more sensational details as later embellishments, there remains a substantial core of evidence that is difficult to dismiss entirely. Multiple witnesses, including some who were not coerced and had no obvious motive to lie, testified to seeing Elizabeth torture and kill servants. Physical evidence of bodies and torture implements was found at the castle. A priest had written letters years before the investigation began, describing atrocities he had witnessed. Parents of missing daughters had filed complaints. There is also a 1602 letter from another priest that discusses the excessive cruelty exhibited by Elizabeth and her husband toward servants, suggesting that abusive behavior was known and documented long before the formal investigation began. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere between the extremes. Elizabeth Báthory was almost certainly guilty of torturing and killing servants, probably dozens of them, possibly more. The exact methods of torture were probably accurately described in the testimonies, as they are consistent across multiple witnesses and match what is known about torture practices of the era. Whether she killed 650 people as legend claims, or 80 as the formal charges stated, or some number in between, is impossible to determine with certainty given the fragmentary nature of the historical record. What seems likely is that the number was substantial enough to be noticed, to generate persistent rumors, to eventually force even reluctant authorities to take action. It is also likely that the political and financial motivations of those who brought her down were real, that Elizabeth's wealth and power made her a target, that King Matthias's debt gave him a strong incentive to see her convicted or at least neutralized. But this doesn't mean the charges were entirely false, only that they may have been exaggerated or emphasized for political gain. The fact that Elizabeth was never formally tried suggests that those who moved against her were uncertain about what a full public trial might reveal, that they preferred to keep the matter as quiet as possible, while still achieving their goals of neutralizing her power and canceling the debts she was owed. What makes Elizabeth Báthory's story so enduringly fascinating is precisely this ambiguity, this tension between documented horror and possible conspiracy, between the monster of legend and the historical woman who may have been something less or something different than the myths claim. She was undoubtedly a product of her time and class, raised in an environment where violence against social inferiors was normalized, where absolute power was concentrated in the hands of a few noble families, where women who inherited wealth and position had few role models for how to wield that power responsibly. She was also clearly damaged in some fundamental way, whether by epilepsy affecting her brain, by childhood trauma, by the example of sadistic relatives, by the corrupting influence of absolute power, or by some combination of all these factors. The castle at Chachta still stands, or at least its ruins do, perched on a rocky hill above the town that shares its name. Tourists can visit the site, can walk through the crumbling stone corridors, and climb the towers and peer into the dungeons where unspeakable acts may have taken place more than 400 years ago. There is an exhibition in the town called Elizabeth Báthory, Cruelty Hidden in Lace, which attempts to separate historical fact from sensational legend, to present a more nuanced view of the woman and the accusations against her. A wooden statue of Elizabeth dominates the town square, though whether this is meant to commemorate her or simply acknowledge her place in the town's history is unclear. For the victims, there is little memory and less justice. Most of them remain nameless, faceless, reduced to numbers in testimonies and court documents. They were daughters of peasants and small nobles, girls between the ages of 10 and 25, some of whom had gone to Chachtis seeking employment or education, others who had been abducted, all of whom met ends that were brutal beyond imagination. A few names survive in the records. Ilonka, a shoemaker's daughter whose torture was described in detail by witnesses. Ursabet, a noblewoman's daughter who was killed in the Gyneseum. Zuzka, another noble daughter whose mother testified at the trial. But most are lost to history, remembered only as victims, their individual lives and personalities erased by violence and time. The story of Elizabeth Báthory raises questions that extend far beyond the specifics of her case. What happens when absolute power is placed in the hands of someone without moral constraints? How do we distinguish between genuine monsters and those who are manufactured by political necessity or cultural mythology? Where is the line between the normal cruelties of an era and acts so extreme that they transcend their historical context? These are not comfortable questions, and they do not have simple answers. Elizabeth lived in a time when torture was commonplace, when public executions were entertainment, when the lives of peasants were considered worth little or nothing. But even within that brutal context, what she allegedly did stood out as exceptional, as crossing lines that even her contemporaries recognized as boundaries that should not be breached. Modern psychology has tried to understand what might have driven Elizabeth to her alleged crimes, though any diagnosis made across 4 centuries is necessarily speculative. Some have suggested she was a sexual sadist, that she derived erotic pleasure from causing pain. The intimate nature of many of the tortures, the focus on breasts and genitals, the biting and consumption of flesh, all suggest some kind of sexualized violence. Others have proposed that she was a psychopath, someone incapable of empathy or remorse, for whom other people existed only as objects to be used and discarded. Still others point to her childhood epilepsy and the possibility of brain damage, to the traumatic treatments involving blood that she underwent as a child, to the example set by sadistic relatives and a brutal husband. Perhaps it was all of these things together, a perfect storm of biological predisposition, childhood trauma, cultural conditioning, and absolute power that created a killer. There is also the matter of her accomplices, the servants who helped her torture and kill for years, who cleaned up the blood and disposed of the bodies and lured new victims to the castle. What motivated them? Fear of their mistress certainly played a role. Refusing orders from someone as powerful as Elizabeth could result in becoming a victim oneself. But some of the testimonies suggest that at least some of the servants participated willingly, that they developed their own taste for cruelty under Elizabeth's tutelage. Ilona Jo had been with Elizabeth since childhood, had helped raise her, had remained loyal even when that loyalty dimmed.